Welcome to a deep dive into how Star Wars became, Star Wars. You send over some really fascinating articles about all the ways the franchise has changed over time. And I have to say, I'm pretty stoked about this one.
Yeah, it's really something. The way this whole universe has been shaped by technology, by cultural shifts, even by how fans react. It's a wild story to dig into.
You're telling me, okay, so I was reading that article you sent about like what science fiction was like back when A New Hope came out in 77. And seriously, can we just acknowledge that was a huge GE risk, right?
Yep.
Back then.
Absolutely. I mean, sci-fi back then, it was seen as this like niche genre. Studios, they were way more into disaster movies and gritty, realistic stuff. Nobody, and I mean nobody, expected a space opera to blow up and become this cultural phenomenon.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about now, especially with like how big these huge franchises are these days. But as that article pointed out, it wasn't just luck or being in the right place at the right time. There was some serious filmmaking going on.
Exactly. That whole thing about ILM, industrial light and magic, it wasn't just some behind-the-scenes trivia. What Lucas's team did, I mean, they basically reinvented special effects. Those practical effects, using models and miniatures, the artistry involved, that had a huge GE impact on everything that came after, not just Star Wars.
And it's crazy how well it all holds up. You mentioned those practical effects, and even with like all the advancements in CGI, there's just something about how the original trilogy looks that's still magical.
I think it's that you can tell it's real. Well, your brain knows it's a model, a miniature, but it feels more real than CGI sometimes, even as technology has gotten better. But the look of it was just one piece of the puzzle. Remember that article you sent over, the one about Joseph Campbell, about the hero's journey and all that?
Oh yeah, about how perfectly Luke's story fits that classic hero thing.
Exactly. Lucas, he tapped into something really universal with that. And it wasn't just Luke either. Darth Vader, his whole arc from villain to, well, I don't want to spoil it for the 5 people out there who've never seen Star Wars.
Right. But you're right, that redemption arc, man, it got to people. Even that article you mentioned, it pointed out how new that was for a movie back then. Okay, switching gears to the prequels. That piece you sent over about how the prequels are actually a big political allegory. Total mind blower.
It's so easy to write off the prequels, right? That they're just about Jedi and the Clone Wars, but there's this whole other layer underneath. It's a commentary about republics falling apart, about what happens when someone gets too power hungry.
Which is so interesting because on the surface, you've got all the cool spaceships and lightsaber fights, but then when you dig a little deeper, it's like, whoa, George Lucas is trying to tell us something here.
Yeah.
And speaking of, bold moves, we have to talk about how the prequels look. That whole switch to using so much CGI, that was a gamble.
It was a gamble, that's for sure. And I mean, it definitely paid off in some ways, but it also got some criticism, like that article you shared pointed out. The CGI, as groundbreaking as it was then, it just hits different than the original trilogy, visually. Some people might even say it's less immersive, especially now that we've had even more time for the tech to, get even better.
Yeah, it's almost, even though it was cutting edge then, the CGI aged faster than the models and stuff. But those political themes you mentioned, you got to give Lucas credit for going there, for tackling those ideas.
And you can't forget how much the prequels added to the overall Star Wars universe. The whole story of how Anakin becomes Darth Vader, the Clone Wars, it gave us a much richer, more complex picture of how this galaxy far, far away actually works.
And that complexity definitely caused some arguments among fans, which, speaking of arguments, brings us to the sequel trilogy. That article you sent about Disney buying Lucasfilm, talk about a big moment, the stakes were so high for those movies.
Oh, for sure. I mean, after dropping all that cash for Lucasfilm, Disney had so much pressure to make something that pleased all the old fans but could also bring in new people. It was a tough thing to balance, and you can really see that in how people reacted to the sequels.
Totally. And they kicked things off with The Force Awakens, which I gotta say, that first time I saw it in theaters, that wave of nostalgia, seeing the Millennium Falcon on the big screen again, it got to me. But you sent over this article that said The Force Awakens played it too safe, didn't it?
Yeah. It's interesting, though. That article argued that while, basically doing A New Hope again worked at the box office, it also started this conversation about how original these big franchises can really be. When does honoring the past just become repeating yourself? It's something people are still talking about today, not just with Star Wars, but with all these reboots and sequels coming out.
Which is such a good point. I mean, we all have those things we love, those things we don't want to see messed up, but then again, you don't want things to get stale. It's tough.
Yeah.
And then The Last Jedi came out, and whoa, boy, that article you sent about Rian Johnson's directing, it all made sense after I read that.
Right. If The Force Awakens was playing it safe, The Last Jedi threw a huge curveball. That article, how it talked about how much Johnson wanted to go against what people were expecting, to challenge the whole idea of what a Star Wars movie could be, it makes you think about how much fans actually want things to change.
And people got so passionate so quickly. I remember watching in the theater thinking, okay, this is not the Star Wars I grew up with, which, could be exciting. But I get why it rubbed some people the wrong way. It questioned some pretty core ideas about those characters and the Force and everything.
Exactly. That's what that article really got right. It wasn't just about the plot. The Last Jedi got people talking about legacy, about failure, about moving on from the past. That's some deep stuff for a big action movie.
No kidding. And then Rise of Skywalker had to follow that.
And wrap up, 40 years of the Skywalker saga? You sent over that piece about how hard it is to end a story everyone knows and loves, and it really resonated with me.
Everyone has their own idea about how it should end. So what do you think? How did Rise of Skywalker stick the landing?
Man, that's a tough one. That article you're talking about, it made the point that while Rise of Skywalker looked amazing and had tons of action, it felt like it was trying too hard to please everybody, which maybe stopped it from being as bold as The Last Jedi.
Yeah, which, given what happened online after The Last Jedi is understandable, I guess. But it makes you wonder what Star Wars could be if it was okay with messing with people's expectations, really pushing the boundaries.
Really? That's a really interesting thing to think about. And it actually leads us perfectly to the next phase of the Star Wars saga, all the stuff outside the movies. In a lot of ways, that's where Star Wars has had the freedom to get really creative.
Oh, yeah. It's like beyond the Skywalker story, there's this whole other galaxy of Star Wars stories out there. And those articles you sent over about all that, wow. We might need another deep dive just to cover it all.
We might need a whole other show. But for now, what really stood out to you about all the stuff happening beyond the Star Wars movies?
For me, it's seeing how shows like The Mandalorian and Ahsoka can take characters and storylines that, we only got a taste of in the movies and really flesh them out. It makes it feel like this universe is so much bigger than we thought. And that article about Ahsoka's journey, forget redemption arcs, she went through a whole character evolution.
It's amazing, right? She started as a Padawan, then she's leading rebels, and now she's almost like this legendary figure connecting all these different eras of Star Wars, which is part of what makes all the stuff outside the movies so cool. You can explore these characters and their stories in a way you just can't in a 2-hour movie.
Right. And The Mandalorian gave us this whole new way to see bounty hunters, the Mandalorians themselves. It's still Star Wars, but it's got that Western feel to it. It's the perfect example of how the franchise can play with different genres without losing what makes it Star Wars.
Totally. Oh, and Andor. Don't even get me started. That show, like you said in your notes, it's basically a spy thriller with a Star Wars coding.
Yeah.
And it's not afraid to show the messy parts of the rebellion, how people had to make tough choices, even compromises, to fight against the Empire.
That's what I loved about it. It made me think about that article you sent, the one about how Star Wars has always been a reflection of when it was made. Like the original trilogy, it came out during the Cold War. The prequels, they were dealing with globalization and all the anxieties of that. And now, shows like Andor, they feel really relevant to all the stuff happening in the world today. All the conversations about authoritarianism, about resisting that kind of power.
For sure. It proves that Star Wars can be more than just escapism. It can make us think about the world around us, spark some debate, make us question our own perspectives. And now we've got The Acolyte coming up, which is going way back, exploring the High Republic era when the Jedi were at their strongest. Who knows what that will show us about Star Wars?
It really feels like Star Wars is this ongoing conversation, and every generation that comes along adds their own thoughts, their own interpretations.
And they find their own way in. Maybe for some people, it'll always be the original trilogy, that feeling of wonder and adventure. But for others, it might be Ahsoka's story, or how Din Djarin is this quiet hero in The Mandalorian.
It's like what you were saying before, what really makes Star Wars. It's not just about lightsabers and the Force. It's about using those things to tell stories that, really get to us on another level.
Exactly. Stories about hope, about being brave, about fighting for what's right, even when it feels like you're up against impossible odds. Those are ideas that never get old, and that's why I think Star Wars will be around for a long, long time. It'll keep changing, keep surprising us.
After this deep dive, I'm even more excited to see what's next for Star Wars.
Me too. Like a certain wise Jedi master said, always in motion is the future.
Well, on that note, I think we've made the jump to light speed. successfully navigated this whole thing about how Star Wars has changed over time.
It's been a great trip.
May the Force be with you.
And also with you.